Welcome to another edition of Anglican Unscripted. This is episode 67. You're watching two men dressed in black, one with a brand new eye collar. I'm Kevin Carlson.
And I'm George Conger. And today's March 11th, 2013.
As most of you are well aware, George, as you can tell by the collar, had surgery. He had spinal stenosis surgery. And for those of you who don't know what that is, stenosis means blockage. Spinal, that's in your spinal cord, in your spinal column. And when you have a blockage there, the doctors want to repair it. The only way you can reach the spine is to take apart some of the vertebrae from the back, and they take it off. They get the little file and clean all the spurs and bone up and assemble it. Now, in the greatest of conditions, you can go in the hospital and be out in 2 days. In the worst case scenario, the doctor will tell you 5 days you'll be here, no big deal. George, who had this surgery 14 days ago on a Monday, was in the hospital for 12 days because he had the worst of the worst case scenarios. He woke up a quadriplegic. George, you've obviously had an interesting 14 days now. Start us off from the surgery to your discovery of your condition and how you've come from there.
Well, it was an 8-hour procedure. I was under the knife, under anesthetic for 8 hours, and I woke up Monday evening. And at first, I thought I had died and gone to hell because I'm in terrific pain. I'm in agony. And there's music playing in the back of my head, and I'm listening to this music, and I'm opening my eyes, and I can't focus, and I can't see, and oh my God, it's West End Girls by the Pet Shop Boys. 80s retro music is playing. I'm in hell, and Satan is gay. Oh my gosh! And I start to move, and I'm not moving. Now I wasn't a quadriplegic. I could move my arms. But my hands above from the wrists were like two dead fish, and I was paralyzed from the waist down. And I had a tube down my throat. I was still in a breathing tube, so I couldn't talk. I couldn't move. I was in terrific agony, and the Pet Shop Boys are playing in my ear. I was not a happy person.
At this point, you must realize the 2 days is not going to be as quick as you thought. So you wake up obviously in tremendous pain. The anesthesiologist or doctor comes in, and what do you tell him?
He says, "How you doing, George? How you feeling?" And I basically tell him I'm paralyzed. I can't move. And, I was panicking because I've always been a very physically active, athletic, may not look it, but very athletic, physical person all my life. Mm-hmm. Always self-reliant, always control of my body, and nothing worked. I was trapped. Mm-hmm. And he said, "I got to get the surgeon." And the surgeon came over, and he examined me, and he said, "Well, let's get you downstairs for a CAT scan." And he said, "I did my job okay, so I know there's nothing wrong with the surgery, but there may be post-surgical complications." He explained to me it's akin like, well, you had a good surgery, but on your way home, it's like being hit by a bus. You can't really blame the surgeon for that. I did my job okay. You shouldn't be like this. Yes, I agree. I shouldn't be like this. So I went downstairs, and I had a CAT scan, and they were checking to see if I had had a stroke. Or if the bone spur or something had broken off and was floating around because they had put in some reinforcements and some screws and cement. Mm-hmm. And this was a very complicated procedure.
Sure.
Well, fortunately, I had not had a stroke, and nothing showed up. And the surgeon said, "Well, we just have to see what happens, but hopefully good news will happen and you'll be fine." Well, needless to say, it was a very bad night for me.
Well, sure. I mean, a little background for people who don't know. You were a hospice chaplain for many years.
6 years. 5 years.
5 or 6 years. You visited dying people. You dealt with relatives of a dying person. You know the culture of hospitals and the culture of caregiving. And here you were at God's full attention. And he had your full attention. At that point, there's often a darkness, a midnight in the soul, we call it.
I began to scream at God in my heart, in my mind, and after a few hours, it hit me, well, maybe God wasn't real. Maybe he didn't exist. Maybe I was one of the good guys. For goodness sake, I'm an Episcopal priest of the Diocese of Central Florida. I should get some respect, thank you very much. And yet, look at me. Look where I was. I mean, life wasn't fair. God wasn't fair. If there was a good God, why would he allow this suffering for me? I mean, I thought I knew what suffering was. Mm-hmm. And I have counseled people in their pain and suffering, and I've been hurt physically and so forth in the past. So I thought I knew. I had no clue. No clue whatsoever. I mean, I can only liken it to like being on a wheel spinning under a bright sun where simultaneously your stomach is nauseous and your head is exploding and there's electricity shooting across your body in different ways and you're on fire and you're freezing and you just are overwhelmed. And at a certain point, I just said, I can't believe God is real. And then I started getting this phrase in my head, and if not, and if not. And I'm thinking, what is that? And I started to think, and I started to pray, and I said, well, God, if you are there, tell me what you're telling me. Tell me what this is. And I remembered the story of Daniel in the 3rd chapter of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the 3 Jewish men who refused to bow down and worship the golden idol of King Nebuchadnezzar. And the king ordered that they be tossed in the fiery furnace unless they recanted. And the 3 men said to King Nebuchadnezzar, our God will save us. We have nothing to fear from your threat. And if not, we will still be faithful to our God anyway. And it hit me. I was called to be faithful to God. And if not, and if I had a bad outcome to surgery, I was still to be faithful to his goodness and to his providence and to trust in him because he, Jesus, God, he's the divine healer. And at that point, I began to get better.
Getting better from spinal surgery can sometimes be instantaneous, and sometimes it takes a while. And obviously you were in the hospital for 12 days. It's taken a while, and you have to learn how to do things differently now.
When I met with a rehab doctor, they said, well, nerve takes about a month to regenerate an inch of nerve tissue.
Millimeters.
So let's figure 6 months for your hands, a year and a half for your legs, if it can be regenerated. Or you may just have a massive stunning, or we just don't know because we can't see anything. We don't know what's going on. And for the first few days, I began slowly to recover sensation. I got all my sensation back, but nothing worked. And then slowly my hands came back, and slowly my legs came back. And so right now, at this moment, I would say I have 90% strength in my right hand, and this has been a dead fish, and 30% strength in my left hand. Now, I can't open it all the way. I have to, in other words, I can't lift my fingers up. But I've been working with rehab, with scissors and physical, it's called occupational therapy, to retrain my hands. I can't use a computer keyboard. I can't use a piano keyboard. I have difficulty buttoning my pants. But I can do today the sort of the activities of daily living that allows me to go home. When I started the rehab, I had to be sat up in a wheelchair. Within a week, I was able to be independent in a wheelchair, and then I spent a week working on a walker, and now I've got a walker, and I've got a cane, and in 6 months' time, they think the way I'm going, I'll be great, I'll be fine. I mean, God has been doing miraculous things in my life in the way of healing, just day after day. It's fantastic.
We've both been in the hospital many times, and it's interesting.
I've never been in the hospital before.
I meant as a
patient.
As a hospice person.
I've been there as a patient. I used to work in one, but I've never been on the other side of the blanket.
It's interesting because as men, women, we always think if God's going to do something, it's a single thing He's going to use us for. And oftentimes, when you're in such a traumatic place in your life, and you're in the midnight of the soul, the darkness of the soul, God is using you on many different fronts. For many different reasons.
Absolutely. I mean, I witnessed to people in the hospital Now, I didn't have my collar on. I wasn't being paid to be an Episcopal priest. And, evangelism is a dirty word for Episcopalians. Yet I just was chatting, just with people. I chatted with this one nurse about, I happened to be reading the first chapter of Philippians, and I was sharing with her as she was preparing my shots, how I really understood what Paul was talking about, how infirmities and suffering and calamity can be used by God to build his kingdom. Because I understood in a way I hadn't before what pain was, what physical limitation was, what being in a wheelchair was. And that allowed me, this was a gift from God. It allowed me to not be a theoretical priest, but an empathetic priest, a priest who out of a point of brokenness and woundedness, where by Christ's stripes we are healed. I know what that meant. And one of the exciting things was that one of the nurses, as I was checking out, talked to my wife, Susan. She was giving her the checkout instructions on what I could and couldn't do. And she took Susan aside and said that George's conversations with me and Susan's encounters with the nurse had basically brought her to a saving faith in Jesus Christ. She had gone back to church for the first time in years. Her name was Precious. She was my night nurse, and she took care of me and washed me. And the things I said to her, I didn't set out to do anything. I just shared what was in my heart. And God, by the action of the Holy Spirit, used this imperfect, twisted, broken vessel to bring someone back into the fold. I mean, God can do anything with anybody.
That's often what's ironic about this situation is we are intentional or not intentional, but the real person who's always intentional in every situation is the Holy Spirit. In this case, God used you in so many different ways in the plight of your doubt, in your healing, and in the person you were as a Christian, as a patient. He used all that as a witness to his glory. And, it's been a long time. I mean, you and I, most of the people who follow my posts on Facebook know that you were injured and had a bad outcome in surgery, and this is probably the first time they've seen you now in at least 2 weeks. And it's wonderful to have you back, and it's wonderful to see how God is doing that. But we also know you're going to take us through your struggle and overcoming in the rehabilitation phase as we go forward, because you're not whole yet in your body, you're whole in your spirit.
Yeah, and, well, the brain's also a bit wonky, too. I mean, I'm not worried at all, because today I celebrated the Eucharist one-handed. I can use this like as a claw, so I can put the cup in here and hold it up and not spill it and have the pad. I celebrated the Eucharist. I preached for a half hour. I sat in a chair in front of the altar. I felt like the Pope. It was neat to preach like that. I was able to visit people in the hospital. I was able to visit people in nursing homes. My ministry as a priest, well, I can't type my sermons, but the power of the Spirit is just burning inside of me. And I'm starting 5 hours a day of physical therapy this coming week, 3 on the hands, 2 on the legs each day. And I bought Dragon Naturally Speaking software so I can dictate my stories. I mean, don't cry for me, Argentina. I mean, there's a lot worse things happening in this world. Money's going to be tight because, I get paid for as much work as I churn out for various publications, and I got to cut back a bit. I wrote a story for Anglican Inc. using one finger with an iPhone. Now, that took 4 hours to write 400 words on Tanzania. I don't think I'm going to be paying the Blue Cross Blue Shield premiums on that rate. So, but God is just doing fantastic things.
We hope that this recording we've done with George will be a witness to you as well. We're here to encourage the body, and God is a provider in all things, whether we realize it or not, whether we're intentional or not. He always is. George, let's move on to our first story. We're going to talk about Tanzania. People who watch us also sometimes read Anglican Inc. And if you have been following the stories there, there's been a new archbishop elected in Tanzania a couple weeks ago. He's replacing Valentin, what's the last name?
Mokiwa.
Mokiwa. And his name is Jacob. I can't pronounce his last name.
Jacob Chimaladia.
You were practicing this in the hospital, weren't you?
Yes, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers for Jacob Chimaladia.
You're very good. So there's been some concern that there was some malfeasance during the election, and some of that revolved around what we call walking around money, where a candidate has money to help not buy votes, but help support people who are going to vote for him. And there's also some constitutional anomalies where the people who were there that day, 3 didn't belong there and shouldn't have voted. The Chimnamle, whatever his name was, sorry about that, won by 3 votes. And there's some other constitutional violations. What have we learned since we first reported the story, George?
We've learned, well, so far, Kevin, we should say that we, apart from the Swahili press in Tanzania, we're the only people who are reporting this story. Anglican Communion News Service is putting out these vanilla press releases. Everything's fine, daisies and roses in Tanzania. And neglecting to mention, well, here's the story. The election took place, and immediately, supporters of Archbishop Mokiwa cried foul because 4 more votes were cast than were electors present. And Bishop Chimaladia won by 3 votes. So the argument goes that the ballot box was stuffed. And on February 27th, 3 complaints were filed with the church by members of the General Synod, lay and clergy members of the group of people who elected the Archbishop, alleging 8 counts of 8 constitutional violations of the process. And they filed this count with the church. Now, on March 3rd, the Anglican Communion News Service released a statement from the General Secretary of the Tanzanian Church saying the bishops have approved the election, all is well, and the consecration will take place in May. What the ACNS neglected to mention was that the House of Deputies and the House, which is made up of clergy and lay people, did not endorse the election of the Archbishop. Now, and they also called for the removal of the General Secretary for being part of the conspiracy. Now, supporters of Archbishop-elect Chimaladia have said this is all nonsense, that claims that American walking around money so that the people united will never be defeated sort of stuff, Jesse Jackson vote bribing stuff, that's all nonsense. That actually this is a local dispute that Archbishop Mokiwa is trying to cloak in American politics to get himself out of a losing situation. We really don't know what's happening.
We don't. We do know one thing. Nobody has clean fingers in Tanzania, no matter what side of orthodoxy or GAFCON or non-GAFCON or pro-tech or anti-tech. Everybody has taken money at one point from the Episcopal Church. There's no clean fingers here. What we're not worried about the clean fingers, we're worried about what happened with the constitutional anomalies and whether there's ballot box stuffing and how they're going to work through this. We know there's a problem. We've reported the problem, but everybody else in the Anglican community has their fingers in their ears and their eyes closed, and that's not how we get through this. We go through this with transparency and honesty. There is 3 official complaints filed with the province of Tanzania, not for people who are unhappy, but people bring to light that we've had some anomalies in how this vote was taken out. And that's where George and I report this. We're not here to do get you politics because this is a GAFCON province that's going to fall. This is bringing light and transparency to something that we need to stop covering up, ACNS.
Well, there's one thing I do want to add, and it's the question of taking American money. There are some provinces, Uganda being one, that have taken a stand that we will not accept money from the Episcopal Church of the USA because of their stance on moral issues. We believe that money is tainted. There are other churches, like Tanzania, that are happy to accept money. there's one retired bishop, he's now retired in Western Tanzania, told me he's happy to accept money from the Diocese of New York and the Diocese of Atlanta, and he would welcome Bishop Catherine Roscom to his diocese, but he always made sure she would go to churches where no one spoke English. If the Americans are crazy to get involved in same-sex blessings, that's their business, but he's got an orphanage that he's got to feed the kids, and he's not going to, until he's found a way to replace that money, he's not going to cut off his nose to spite his face. To think that that the Africans get upset when basically they're told that because you take money, your faith is conditioned upon cash. No, that's, for some of them, that's very insulting. For others, like the Ugandans, that is a way they operate. So we really need to be careful in saying just because you take American money, you're in the pocket of 815.
Now, what happens further from here, George and I are expecting, is we've heard internally there's going to be 5 more complaints filed from different dioceses in Tanzania. That's important because it shows it's an evolving story, but it's also important that we let you know that it's almost impossible to get news out of a third world country. We hear stuff, and it took a whole week before we went public with the story because you have to verify so many things when it's someplace in the middle of Tanzania where this is happening. This isn't happening in Lambeth Palace, God, I hope not. And it's happening way over in a country far, far away where the broadband isn't stellar like it is here.
And we also need to remember that there is a culture in Africa, as in many other parts of the world, that you just don't air your dirty laundry. Mm-hmm. I mean, if there's bad news, you don't let anybody know about it. Whereas in the United States, if there's bad news, hey, you let everybody know about it. So we're working both with cultural issues about how news is disseminated, as well as technical issues of this is the other side of the world. And most of this stuff is all in Swahili.
So, watch the show. We'll have more updates next week, I assure you, from my sources in Tanzania. And it's an evolving story, and it's not one we plug our ears to or close our eyes. We be transparent about. That's how God operates. Okay, Alan, let's move on to our first piece of news. We're going to talk about an accord that was just announced between the Episcopal Church and the Fort Worth and Quincy bishops who have been brought up on, were threatened with charges for interfering with legal proceedings in the Episcopal Church. We have an accord today that was released. They had a gentleman they were working with, a James Douglas, who was a conciliatory appointed by the Episcopal Church. And I'm reading this accord today, and it kind of occurs to me that this is some type of witness intimidation more than it is an agreement by both sides.
Yeah, formally what it is, an accord is a resolution of a Title IV disciplinary charge. It's one of the possible outcomes when disciplinary charges are brought against bishops and clergy. And so the accord is the result of, in this case, a quote-unquote conciliation process led by the mediator or conciliator. And it consists of a formal agreement of terms to which both sides agree. And in this case, the agreement is pretty much one-sided. All the bishops all agree not to do various things and make various concessions. And the only concession the Episcopal Church makes for its part is to drop all the disciplinary charges against them.
Yeah, so in lay speak, we will not discipline you if you do not exercise your rights, answer the judges or lawyers' questions in court, and pay the fees for this conciliation. Is that what
right.
Do I see?
Well, yeah, that's it's mostly that. First thing is they express regret for any harm they caused by filing their affidavits and their amicus curiae briefs in Texas, and then they agree not to file any more affidavits or amicus curiae briefs in any proceedings outside of their own diocese. And of course, all that's left now is, the proceedings in Texas are going to be decided by the Texas Supreme Court. That may be the end of everything. If it goes down, then there'll be further proceedings in court, and there's nothing said about testifying in court. It's just filing amicus brief and filing affidavits. So however, what happens is they go on also and agree that the position they hold, and it's expressed in the bishop's polity statement a couple of years ago, is probably a minority position in the church, quote unquote. And they also agree that the bishop, diocesan bishop, is restrained, quote unquote, by the Dennis canon, which is a totally untrue statement if there ever was one, which makes me question the character of the legal proceedings in this conciliation. The professor who was the conciliator obviously was not a canon law attorney, and I don't think the bishops had proper canon law advice in making that agreement. It's ridiculous to say that the Dennis canon constrains bishops. Bishops in dioceses sell properties, agree to sell properties all the time, and they never go and get permission of the national church to do so. So it's ridiculous to say that the canon constrains them in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, in fact, the canon is written so that it does not constrain a bishop from doing what a bishop wants to do.
Well, it certainly doesn't apply to diocesan property to begin with, and these cases all involve diocesan property. So, what's the point of having them say something about the Dennis canon in cases that don't involve the Dennis canon? I mean, it's just gratuitous.
It is. I was very provocative in the intro here. I use the words witness intimidation, witness tampering, call it what you want. This exists in law quite frequently. Sometimes it's hidden, sometimes it's not. Here they're very open about it, and I can think back to the most famous case of all is the high priest v. Jesus v. Christ back in the 30 A.D. So this is not...
the trial of Jesus, right? They suborned false witnesses to testify against him. Caiaphas, the high priest, right?
Yeah, so it's not something unexpected and not something that doesn't happen. It's more common than it's ever revealed in this. Now, basically, this is called a conciliation, but the only people who gave anything up here were the bishops. It doesn't look like the Episcopal Church gave any leeway at all in this accord.
I gather it's going to, quote unquote, contribute to the costs, but the bishops are expected to contribute to the costs as well. So, yeah, there's very, very little that the Episcopal Church put on the table here. And it was mostly the threat and intimidation, which is what it is, of further disciplinary proceedings if you don't capitulate on these terms.
Okay.
And that is not going to sit well. That's going to harm the Episcopal Church's case in Quincy to begin with, because Bishop Beckwith, retired Bishop of Diocese of Springfield, is one of the witnesses scheduled to be called in that case as an expert witness. And this is going to come out in the course of that proceeding, that this is what the Episcopal Church did to try to alter his testimony. And I don't think it's going to sit well with the court. But that's for the court to decide.
That's the interesting question here, is can a judge take this? This isn't a jury trial, right? This is before a judge. And so
jury trial, right?
Yeah,
right.
Can the judge say to Bishop Beckwith, is there any reason you're not giving a full testimony today? What would Bishop Beckwith say?
Yeah, the council, his own council would ask that question probably, and Bishop Beckwith would have to say, well, I had to, under threat of disciplinary proceedings, I had to agree to that I would no longer file an affidavit, and I had to agree that my position I'm espousing is probably, quote unquote, a minority position in the church, but I'm sticking to my guns. Notwithstanding, I think it's the correct position, and he's fully correct if he would say that. So as I say, what it's going to go to is the weight of the testimony offered by the Episcopal Church, because whatever their experts say, it's obvious that the only way they can get their experts to say something is by threatening the opposition witnesses. And so with disciplinary proceedings for trying to say anything to the contrary, which doesn't give you great confidence in the testimony or the case being offered by the Episcopal Church if it needs that kind of measure to protect it from attack.
Can the judge use this when he weighs his decision?
He definitely can. He can definitely say that the degree of intimidation that went on here is unseemly and an attempt to interfere with the integrity of these proceedings, and I find accordingly, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, the next question a lot of the viewers are going to ask, well, can the Episcopal Church be brought up on, charges here, these aren't civil charges, but if you're brought up on criminal witness tampering or witness intimidation charges, is that something that could happen here?
Well, that's an Indiana state law question, a criminal law question under Indiana criminal law. And that would I don't see that happening here. That would be the decision of the local prosecutor in Indiana, whether to file such charges. Witness tampering, I have to point out, is that this doesn't amount to that, because tampering is actually bribing a witness without being open about it and without telling the court about what's happened. That is not what has happened here. They've been very open about the intimidation they've applied. They've published the accord. So it amounts to a sort of a civil witness intimidation, and I think it goes to the bias and the effect of the intimidation on the testimony that both sides are offering, and the court will take that into account. I don't see any criminal charges growing out of this, no.
All right, Alan, I think it's going to be an interesting story that Anglican Unscripted viewers are going to follow. You can follow it more on the Anglican Curmudgeon blog. I'm putting the link here at the bottom. You certainly give daily updates. Now, here's a secret. This is not Alan's home in the background. You're actually on vacation. The Episcopal Church is famous for doing most of their big court cases while you're in Asheville. Where are you again, Ashland?
Ashland, Oregon, right?
Yeah,
we're seeing some nice plays.
He's at a bed and breakfast. He wakes up, he reads the news, and goes, "Of course, I'm on vacation." Let's move on to our second story, Alan, and this is all legal tech news, and that's why we're having multiple stories with Alan. George is obviously still recovering, and maybe we'll have Peter on later in the episode. We'll see what we can get on this week. So let's talk more about some of the legal things going on in the Episcopal Church. You've been involved from the beginning in a course with the San Joaquin case. And can you give us a little background of what is involved in that case? What are the two sides fighting over?
Right. In December 2007, the annual convention of the Episcopal Diocese of San Joaquin voted to pass on second reading an amendment to its constitution, which effectively caused the diocese to disaffiliate from the Episcopal Church. That did not sit well with 815. And what they did, as we know, is they swooped down into San Joaquin and installed Bishop Lamb as a provisional bishop of those who wished to remain in the Episcopal Church. And the very next day, he turned around and filed a lawsuit against his confrere, Bishop Schofield, and did not name Bishop Schofield's diocese, simply named Bishop Schofield and which he held the properties in trust for his parishes, and wanted to have all those properties and all the bank accounts and money of the diocese surrendered to Bishop Lamb. That lawsuit, as I say, filed in April of 2008, is still proceeding. It went up to the Court of Appeal for the 5th District in 2010, and was the original judgment which the Episcopal Church had obtained in the trial court was reversed by that court. Mm-hmm. The court said the civil courts cannot decide questions like who is the proper bishop of a diocese, whether it's Schofield or Lamb, and they will have to confine themselves to resolving property issues on neutral principles. And so now we're back down in the trial court after 4 years and going into our 5th year. And the Episcopal Church once again moved for summary judgment that they were entitled to all the property. And just recently, the court issued a tentative ruling, tentative meaning that's his giving his thinking on the case. Oral argument is still to be heard, and that'll occur next Wednesday. The judge then can take the ruling under advisement. He can change his mind, issue a different ruling. So we're just dealing with the tentative ruling, but it's very telling. He set it out in writing, and it's available for anyone to read on the internet. And it's, as I say, it's very telling in the reasons he gives for denying the summary judgment motion to the Episcopal Church this time around. He said this Court of Appeal sent this case back to be decided on neutral principles of law. And that means I have to look at the governing documents of the church and the diocese. And you've given me a whole bunch of canons and constitutional provisions, but there's nothing in there that expressly says a diocese may not leave the church. And furthermore, the court cited the First Amendment and said it would be a question if there were such a provision, whether it would violate the diocese's First Amendment rights to associate with the organization which it chooses. So not only did it say that there's no provision that has been shown that would justify a summary judgment as a matter of law without going to trial, that a diocese cannot leave the church, but if there were such a provision, it could well run afoul of the First Amendment. So basically, this throws the case back to now the only resolution. If he adheres to this tentative decision, it will mean that the case will have to go to trial. But the interesting thing about this is that what are they going to put on in evidence that they haven't been able to put in evidence already at the trial? There simply is no provision in the national constitution prohibiting dioceses from leaving, and there's no canon to that effect either. And the canon, of course, wouldn't be binding on the diocese anyway. So it's an interesting thing. It's a major milestone, I think, in this lawsuit, and it finally shows a California judge who gets what is going on here. The Episcopal Church is just waving its hands and saying, we're hierarchical, we're entitled to determine who's the bishop of what diocese, and when a diocese can't leave, and people can leave, but dioceses cannot. And the judge says, wait a minute, just show me that, where it says that. And you haven't done so. In fact, he said they have utterly failed to provide any such evidence. So that's pretty strong language.
It is, because the Dennis Canon has been always applied to churches. Here we have the first diocese to vote in 2 consecutive conventions to change their bylaws where they are not subject to, in any way, the Episcopal Church. This is lay speak.
And you were there, Kevin. You were there recording the history. Is that happened?
Yeah, and it was history. And as such, the Episcopal Church set up their legal strategy for San Joaquin and all other court cases where they will go in, set up a abrupt diocese, and then claim to be the real diocese of San Joaquin in this case. What really happened here is they were able to lock down all the money in San Joaquin by going to court and suing. And San Joaquin was not able to...
Actually, all they had to do, Kevin, was make a phone call to Merrill Lynch, which is one of their chief bankers, and Merrill Lynch agreed to freeze all the accounts. They didn't even have to go to court to do that. Typical Episcopal Church maneuver.
Amazing. So we're now, let's get this straight. We're 4 years in, and we have our
5 years.
5 years in, and we have our first, semi-temporary order. Now, we always thought the victory was with the Supreme Court sending it back or going to the state Supreme Court. Is this really a victory, or we really won't know for a while?
Well, as I say, it's tentative, so nothing will be final until the court issues its final ruling in another week or two. But I don't see him changing his mind for the reason he's saying, hey, there's no evidence in the record, and they can't now introduce evidence in the record. And furthermore, there's just no evidence to be introduced if there did have a further opportunity. So that's why I think this is so strong.
How does this relate to other cases like Fort Worth, Quincy, and now South Carolina? Can they use this judge's determination and say, California says you don't have the right to do this. Why would you have the right in this state?
Well, this is an ironic point with me. This is a trial court's determination, so it's not binding on any other courts in California. But the Episcopal Church is the very first one. When the first decision came down from the same court, Fresno Superior Court, the Episcopal Church quoted it and attached it to decisions and briefs all across the country saying, look at what California is saying. So, I mean, yeah, you could do that, but it won't really be a binding precedent for other courts to look at until it goes up to the appellate level after this case is resolved. So we're still probably years away from that. That being said, it is significant because it, for example, puts the lie to the admission that the bishops were forced to agree to in the conciliation port we talked in the earlier segment, that namely this is quote-unquote a minority position in the church. Well, it may be a minority position in the church, but it hasn't been bought yet by any single court anywhere. And so, therefore, so far, if San Joaquin stays this case, and if Fort Worth comes out this way, and Quincy, which goes to trial next month, comes out the same way, then it's not going to be exactly what you can describe as a minority position.
Well, I need to back up here. According to an accord I read this morning, there is no minority report in the church. There's only one report,
right.
And if you differ from that report, you will be brought up on charges, right?
Yeah, if you publish a difference with that report, correct. And try to tell a court that report. So, that's what makes this accord such a ridiculous thing, because it's trying the Episcopal Church trying to insist on its own way, regardless of what any court says. And that's what we'll see also when we get to the third segment of this in the case in South Carolina. This is behavior of the Episcopal Church that is consistent across the board. It tends to plow its own way, go dead ahead, straight ahead, doesn't care what the courts rule, doesn't care what the courts say. It sticks to its argument, and it relentlessly applies it across the board. And it's been a successful recipe so far with parishes. And it worked in Pittsburgh with the one diocese where they made a foolish stipulation that the court then used against them. But it isn't going to work in San Joaquin, I don't think, and it's not going to work in Fort Worth, and I'd be very surprised if it worked in Quincy.
Well, let me set out that when we're saying there's a tentative agreement, all they really want is a summary judgment. That doesn't mean they've won the case.
It was denied. The summary judgment, that was a huge thing.
Right.
Yeah. The fact that it was denied means that now the only remedy they have left is to go to trial. Mm-hmm. And at trial, as I say, what other evidence have they got to introduce? There's no evidence of any written provision. In fact, as I documented on my blog, there was a time in the late end of the 19th century when the Episcopal Church actually considered provisions that would have made general convention in the Supreme Court or the supreme body in the Episcopal Church, and the diocese all rejected that and turned it down. So this whole argument that the Episcopal Church is some creature that's far superior and above the rest of the diocese is nonsense. What the Episcopal Church is simply is the collection of its own dioceses. They are the ones who, when they come together in general convention, constitute, quote unquote, the Episcopal Church. It's nothing more than that. It's kind of like, the United Nations. The United Nations is body, but it only acts when people are assembled in General Assembly. There's a secretariat, of course, just the way the church has 815. It does its own kind of stuff on the side and, gets to play around at being in between the sessions of the General Assembly. But basically, the United Nations as such is nothing without the people assembled to decide what it's going to do. And you can't, the United Nations can't order any member of a nation to do anything.
Yet.
Similarly here, the Episcopal Church can't order a diocese. Yeah.
Yet. Thank you, Alan, for the report. All right, Alan, let's move on to our third and final legal story this week. And we don't often have three juicy stories like this, so it's kind of nice that you and I get to sit down in our darkened shirts, and you on vacation and me in a snowstorm. Let's talk about the Episcopal Church's legal fight in South Carolina. A little background here. November 16th, South Carolina voted to leave or change their canons so that they no longer refer to the Episcopal Church or General Convention. They would have no authority over the diocese. Now, in neutral principles, you're allowed to choose who you affiliate with and who you don't affiliate with. And right. South Carolina has, a little background, decided in the Pawleys Island case that the Dennis canon does not apply to churches, while that would certainly go to indicate that it doesn't apply to dioceses. We are now to the point where the Episcopal Church has, since November 16th, been duplicating or copying or presenting themselves as the official diocese of the Episcopal Church. Mark Lawrence has in turn sued them in state court, saying you can't use the seal or the name the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina. The Rump Diocese met, had a meeting. They did not use the seal. They used a temporary name, and there was an injunction filed in court by Mark Lawrence that we just mentioned, and they did not fight that injunction in any way.
No, they agreed to its entry.
Right. We are now at March 9th recording here, and we're talking about the Episcopal Church filing in federal court, completely ignoring state courts, going to the federal court and using what's called the Lanham Act, saying that our trademark is being infringed. Please do something to stop Mark Lawrence and the diocese.
Correct. The Lanham Act is the Federal Trademark Act, and it generally applies to trademarks been registered with the U.S. Trademark Office. However, you can make a common law argument as well under the Lanham Act. And so That's what they're trying to do here. It's interesting because it was Mark Lawrence and his diocese that registered these trademarks under South Carolina law. Mm-hmm. And now they're saying, well, these registered marks belong to us. And so it's not only that, but it's a tremendous amount of chutzpah to agree to an injunction against you that you will not use the term the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina, and then 1 week later go into another court and claim to be the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina, entitled to an injunction against the party who you just agreed to an injunction against you. And so I just, I shake my head at this. I mean, I just don't understand where the legal thinking or the strategy comes that thinks they can get away with this.
Well,
for one thing,
that's what I really want to ask about, because a judge sits at a bench and has to make decisions. Is a judge allowed to weigh the fact? Is a state judge allowed to weigh the fact that she was ignored, and the plaintiff or the people went to federal court?
Certainly. There are two kinds of offenses, I think, that have occurred here. One is a violation of the state judge's order, temporary injunction, to which they consented. Mm-hmm. That's what makes it even. It's not as though they agreed that this was improper or fought it and it was entered against over their objections. They consented to it. And so so that's one thing. That order has definitely been violated. And it's up to the state court judge to decide, upon presentation of proper evidence of what happened, what she's going to do about it, and if she's going to impose any fines or sanctions. Then there's a second thing. In the federal court itself, there's a rule, the Rules of Federal Civil Procedure, Rule 11, says that whenever you sign a pleading or any other motion or affidavit in federal court, you're attesting to the fact that it is in good faith, not for the purposes of to harass, delay, or annoy someone in other litigation, and that it is what it purports to be. You're not misrepresenting any facts to the court. So here we have Bishop von Rosenberg, provisional bishop of the Episcopal Church in South Carolina, to use their name, coming into federal court and saying, I am the bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina, when the group itself has been prohibited from using those words and expressly declined to adopt those words. Here he is coming in and saying, I'm the bishop. And that, to me, is a violation of Rule 11 as well. And so both the bishop and his attorneys, and it's very interesting to note that the Episcopal Church, in typical fashion here, got 3 attorneys, 3 different law firms, one in Washington, D.C., one in Alabama, and the other one, the local one in South Carolina, to come in and file this complaint on behalf of Bishop von Rosenberg. But missing from the names on the pleadings are the law firm of the presiding bishop's chancellor, Goodwin Proctor. They did not join in this lawsuit. Now, one has to ask why. And it's possible, as I say, I don't know. I'm not privy to these proceedings. Well, more facts will come out, but this is a very interesting development to me, because why the presiding bishop and her chancellor's law firm stayed away from this lawsuit is one of the big questions that I think has to be resolved.
Well, I think one of the reasons is what the judge can do. I mean, you can be held in contempt. Correct.
Well, and under Rule 11, you're subject to sanctions up to and including dismissal of your complaint. Mm-hmm. So that it prohibits from filing. So now we come to the second reason why this lawsuit is highly questionable. That's the first. It violates the state court order, and it may well violate Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Procedure as well. But the second and important reason, and this is unbelievable, and again to me, they're seeking an injunction, all right, in federal court against Bishop Lawrence using the name the Episcopal Diocese of South Carolina, mm-hmm. or the Protestant Episcopal Church in South Carolina. And that is an injunction which, if entered by the federal court, would effectively kill Bishop Lawrence's state court lawsuit. It would bring a halt to it, because he could no longer pretend that he was the owner of the marks, and this was the owner of the marks in state court. So effectively what the federal court is being asked to do is enter an injunction against the state court proceeding. Now, they don't spell it out in so many words in their federal complaint. They're too careful to do that, but that's the net result of what they're asking. And there's this statute, federal statute, that's been around since 1793.
A long time, yes. States rule.
designed to keep federal courts from interfering with state court proceedings through injunctions. Mm-hmm. It's called the Anti-Injunction Statute. And it simply says federal courts shall not issue injunctions against state court proceedings unless they have to do so to protect their own jurisdiction, which is not involved here. It gives a few exceptions, but none of those exceptions apply here. And in the Lanham Act, there's no U.S. Supreme Court case on point, but there's definitely federal law. The Lanham Act injunctions issued a prior pending proceeding in state court asking for trademark infringement. That's what we have here. Trademark infringement in state court came first, second case in federal court, and you have federal cases and precedents saying Lanham Act can't be used in this way. Now, here's the most fascinating part of this. That being the law, well settled, been around with us for a long, long time, you think that they would point out this law to the federal court when they filed and asked for their injunction. The most recent papers they filed just the other day contain a whole almost 20-odd page memorandum of law in which the anti-injunction statute is not even cited once. It's not mentioned. Now, I don't know what you think, Kevin, but I have the training as an attorney of long-standing that you do not ever mislead the court about applicable authority. You always go out of your way to point out to the court how this possible other authority applies, but we don't think it applies for this reason and this reason and this reason. You don't wait for the other side to point out that, hey, you haven't cited this statute over here. Well, that is not the way to get on good terms with the court.
It's not, but it is kind of modus operandi, especially when you go up against neutral principles, which they've gone up against time and time again. They don't cite the full case law of neutral principles.
Right.
The difficulty is the
and when you look
Presbyterian
at
Church.
And when you look at the fact that 3 law firms have been employed on this proceeding, they filed already over 300 pages of papers in the court. So let's say our cost is already approaching $100,000.
Oh, easily.
And they haven't even, and they probably haven't even brought to the court's attention the chief argument against their whole lawsuit. Mm-hmm. Now, to me, that's not money that's being well spent. And whoever is directing this and advising it is not giving the people who make the decisions on this the information they need to go forward, or else that's one possibility. The other possibility is that damn the torpedoes, full steam ahead. That's what the thing is. We don't care what the stinking law says. We're going to go ahead and push everything we've got.
Well, there's an interesting reality here, because as a lawyer, you have some responsibility to tell your client when they have a case or not to have a case, when to go to court, because you're an officer of the court. If this is, if you believe your client is going to lose,
you're an officer of the court. So
you have the obligation to say this, you shouldn't go, stop.
Right. Well, you certainly, as an officer of the court, what your first and foremost duty is to call the court's attention to any precedent that might possibly bear on the claims that you are making. That's the first and foremost the duty you owe to the court. The duty you owe to your client is to advise your client, hey, there's this statute out there that could sink us. And this whole lawsuit may be for naught. The court may simply just stay the proceeding here, because that's what happened in Fort Worth. The federal, this is just modus operandi. Time and time again, they try this. They went into federal court in the Fort Worth action, accusing Bishop Eicher of infringing his own trademarks of his diocese. And the federal court, quite probably, following precedent, said, we're going to stay this proceeding because there's a prior state court action involving the same claims that came before this case. And under the precedents, we don't go there. We're going to wait for the state court proceedings to wind themselves out and see what's decided there before we take up these claims. And I'm saying that's probably what's going to happen in South Carolina as well, because federal courts are very good at following precedent.
Now, they seem to be stepping up. If they don't get their happiness in federal court, can they go to some international court that we've heard about?
Well, from the federal district court in South Carolina, their next appeal would be up to, I think it's the 4th Appellate Circuit Court of Appeals.
Right,
and
my question there was kind of being funny, but the reality is, when you're in federal court, when you go to this level, are you able to pick a judge that you want to go to, or is this assigned pretty much randomly?
yeah, it's luck of the draw. And in this case, I saw recently the case had been assigned to a senior federal judge, which means one who's retired and who has lots of time able to look into these things.
All right, Alan, thank you for your report. Can you let us know, when are you taking vacation next year? I'm sure the Episcopal Church wants to know.
Right.
All right, that's the end of the segment. I'd like to welcome my good friend Peter Old, all the way from Canterbury, England. That's across the pond. Or for people who watch from England, you know where it is. So, that's where the Archbishop resides.
Get on with it, Kevin.
Okay, hey, let's talk about what's happening on in the Diocese of Sheffield. You're having what we call border crossing issues, and it's something that's been dealt with for hundreds of years within the Anglican Church, but it's been dealt with in a heresy level. What's happening now?
Okay, border crossing in Sheffield. Let's go back about 10 years or so. There's a great Anglican church in Sheffield called Christ Church Forward, a really good conservative evangelical church. And they wanted to plant a church in the centre of Sheffield, which they call Christ Church Central. And they tried to get the diocese to approve, but the current bishop at that point wasn't really up for it. He just about handled having something called St. Thomas's Philadelphia created as an extra parochial place under a bishop's mission order, where they literally carved a little space out of a parish and turned it was like a warehouse for the church and the offices and so on, and they kind of made that into what they call an extra parochial place. So he just about handled that, but Christ Church Forward planting as well was just a bit too much for him. So Christ Church Forward planted Christ Church Central as essentially a kind of independent church. And then Christ Church Central planted the church Christ Church Walkley. Walkley is a part of Sheffield, so that's an independent church. Fast forward 10 years to the last 2 or 3 years. There's a new bishop in Sheffield, a guy called Stephen Croft, evangelical, really mission-minded, really into evangelism. It now turns out that one of the first things he did when he became bishop was that he went to Christ Church Central and said, can we regularize you as proper Anglicans? Can we put you under a mission order? So basically you can operate outside of the parish system. You don't have to cough up your parish share or quota or, the money, basically. And you can basically have a free reign to do mission with an official Church of England badge, okay? And the response from Christ Church Central apparently was, no, thank you. We don't like the fact that there are some liberals in the Church of England, so we don't want to be part of it. Okay, fair, fine. But they didn't want to be Church of England, which means they didn't want to be Anglican. Fast forward to this month, and the minister in charge of Christ Church Walkley goes to Kenya and gets ordained by a Kenyan bishop as an Anglican deacon and gets sent back to Sheffield to run the church there. Now, all our friends in America and Canada, you know what this is called. This is called border crossing, right? And you do border crossing when the bishop is a heretic or the diocese is just teaching rampant nonsense constantly, right? It's a principle. It goes back to St. John Chrysostom back in the first millennia, who basically overthrew a bishop, literally overthrew a primate on that basis. And that's why we've been having border crossing in the States, right? Because you've got bishops who are heretics. Okay, so the bishop is no longer a proper bishop because he's a heretic. So put in a new bishop, right?
So let's speak here. The Bishop of Sheffield, evangelical, good bishop, not a heretic, not false gospel, gave the opportunity for this church to become under his bishopship and become a missional. We have missions and parishes. They said no. The rector, or not rector yet, goes and becomes a rector under a Kenyan bishop.
Yes. It's deeply un-Anglican.
It is, if you want to use the terms of heresy and stuff like that. My question is this church a outreach of the bishop in Kenya? That would make it truly border crossing.
Well, in some senses, it must be, because the bishop ordains him and then sends him off to Sheffield, right?
Yes.
So he's border crossing, like it or not. He's border crossing, and the thing about border crossing is that when you cross a border, you're implying that the local bishop is a heretic, because otherwise you wouldn't need to cross the border. Because in the Anglican Communion we have the Nicene principle, which is basically in one place one bishop. End of story.
Well, this is obviously a developing story. A lot of things in England are really developing. We got Justin Welby, we got the Sheffield things, all the blogosphere is all a Twitter about Justin Welby and reconciliation. This is kind of been a background story that's been developing. What has your bishop said recently about this church, or the Bishop of Sheffield?
The Bishop of Sheffield. Well, as soon as it emerged, the news, there was a kind of a brief press release saying we didn't know anything about it, and then there was this second press release which was kind of hinting at the fact that they tried to do reconciliation. But now I've been talking to my sources. It appears very clearly that they offered them everything that they needed to operate as Anglicans with as much freedom as they wanted, and they turned it down. And I think the Bishop of Sheffield's a mighty bit peed off by this. I don't know what it's about. I mean, the whole idea that you would have foreign bishops in the states who board across, and then as the ACNA is set up, release their churches, as you said, to Bob Duncan, is the classic approach of St. John Chrysostom, which is to basically set up alternate structures for the heretical structures. And once they're in place, that is the church in that place. Right, so you don't need to board across, right. But it just strikes me as though this thing in Sheffield is really jumping the gun before it happens. We've got big fights coming up in England. We've got we've got same-sex marriage. We've got the Pilling report reporting on human sexuality at the back end of the year. That who knows which way that will go. We've got all these fights, and we need Orthodox unity in the Church of England. I had two bishops separately, when the first time I wrote about this, tweet me privately a direct message, but basically saying, we are infuriated by this. These are evangelical bishops. We are infuriated about it. And here's the thing, right? Michael Nazir Ali is the champion of the evangelicals in this country. He's not said a word about Sheffield. Okay, now that should be the mark for those involved in Sheffield to go, hang on a minute. If Michael Nazir Ali cannot come out and publicly support this, have we done the right thing? And I have to say, I think they've done the wrong thing. I am well up for border crossing, okay? If the bishop is a heretic, if he's stopping mission, if he's inhibiting Orthodox clergy from doing ministry, cross those borders. Just go for it. But that is not the case in Sheffield at all.
Okay. All right, so we finally got Jill to stop texting. That should help. And my audio
if you
is
say that she's asking, "What do you want on your pizza?" Show's over.
No, she's asking how is George. He's fine. Oh God. No.
I had to get Susan and I went out to lunch after church today to Sonny's Barbecue, and I had to have a salad bar.
Salad? How do you? I don't even know how to spell salad.
I mean, and Susan said, "Well, I'll have the rib combination, the dry and the spicy St. Louis style, with French fries and baked beans and some onion rings on the side." And I had a salad bar with pineapple chunks.
Oh, that's too good.
No, it's not too good, Kevin. It's awful. It's un-American.
It's unhuman. I think, one of the biggest design flaws is having